I was very nervous this morning. In fact, I about dropped the mic. Being here with all this talent, and I rarely sing anymore, and I'm rarely asked to preach anywhere. But you folks make it so easy, and it's so good to be back here with Brother John and his wonderful family. I know you know it, but you have a wonderful pastor wife. They don't come finer than John and his wife and their family, Martha and their children. And it was a wonderful lesson this morning, taught by Dr. Hines. I've told many people Randy Hines is a hidden treasure in our movement, and he is one of the finest preachers to come across in our movement in a very long time. I sang for a camp meeting, in fact, our home camp, Remus, Michigan, Remus camp this past summer, and I told his parents, I said, your boy is one of the finest preachers that I have ever heard. And you all are privileged to have them attend here. And of course, it's good to see my old friend Philly Willie back there. And I pastored Phil when he was 7. And Phil, I know you don't want me to, but can I tell him a story? When I pastored Phil, he would sit on the front pew on Sunday morning and play a tambourine. And there wasn't one thing that was on beat. I mean, he may have got lucky a few times, but... And his dad, Jack, came to me and said, Brother Plemmons, I've got a question. He said, you know about music, and I don't. I wouldn't know it if I saw it walking down the road. He said, I'm thinking about enrolling Philip in piano lessons. What do you think? I said, I wouldn't if I were you. I said, Jack, in my opinion, the kid doesn't have an ounce of music in him. Yeah, it was one of the most stupid things I ever said. But and I won't tell him, Phil, that time I took you fishing and you caught those hot dogs. I won't tell him about that. But it's good to be here with you guys tonight. And I've been hounded all day about preaching a short message tonight. So we'll try. Now, this is going to be a little bit different tonight, and I'm going to tell you ahead of time that I'm not Pastor John. He jumps around and flies from the balcony. I mean, I don't do that. And if I did, you might need to be calling 911 in a hurry. But if they asked me if I need the ear thing tonight, I said, no, I'll be parking right there. I won't vary. But just a verse of scripture that I want to read on your hearing, one verse of scripture found in Psalms chapter 126, verse number 5, where it says, he that sows in tears shall reap in joy. He that soweth in tears shall reap in joy. Iris Stanfield was having a pretty rough time. He had gone through a pretty nasty divorce. He said, my life was basically falling apart. And he said, I wondered if I would even survive. He said, so I began to ask God to purge me of all the wickedness in my life and to take out things that are in my life that shouldn't be there. And he said, God, little by little, began to wash my eyes out with tears. And he said, I realized after God had cleansed me and purged me of all the wickedness in my heart. And he said, I realized after God washed my eyes out with tears, he said, I noticed that I began to see life a whole lot more clearly. And of course, you know, he wrote the song, he washed my eyes with tears, that I might see the broken heart I had. It was good for me. He tore it all apart and looked inside. He found it full of fear and foolish pride. He swept away the things that made me blind, and then I saw the clouds, they were silver lined, and now I understand that it was best for me. He washed my eyes with tears so that I might see. This evening, I would like to talk to you about our tears. First of all, I want to give you the tears of the sinner. Dr. Billy Graham said, sin will take you farther than you ever thought you would ever go. It will keep you a lot longer than you ever planned on staying, and it will cost you a whole lot more than you ever thought you could afford to pay. Now, it doesn't matter which way you cut it, sin is a hard taskmaster. Bill Chambers married my cousin. He was basically a low-down sinner. I can remember after the divorce, Bill would come to our church in Taylor, Michigan, in the Detroit area, and he would say to my dad, he would say, Uncle Ernie, he said, I would give anything if I could have the peace of mind and heart that you have. My dad would tell him again and again, Bill, that's exactly what it's going to take. It's going to take you giving anything. It's going to take you giving up the world. Many times, I don't know how many times I've watched Bill Chambers come and lay over the altar, and he would just bawl and cry. And he would walk back to his seat unchanged. He died about a year ago, as far as I know, just how he lived. And he's a classic example because you see, friends, when you live life on your own terms, when you live life to please yourself, you can expect tears to be a normal part of your life. The devil would like to make cigarettes look good, but he doesn't want you to see the CT scan of your lungs after the cancer diagnosis. The devil would like to make you think that sex outside of marriage is okay, but he doesn't want you to know the price tag that comes along with that moment of pleasure. He would like to make you think that it's okay to take that first drink, but he doesn't want you to see the homeless people who are on the streets today. And in fact, in our area, you can drive downtown Detroit if you have a carry permit. It's not advisable. In fact, a police officer told me when I used to make deliveries downtown Detroit, he told me, he said, we didn't require guys of your color to even stop at stop signs in Detroit. He said, because you're more likely to get killed down here. It's a pretty dangerous place. But they say in any night in Detroit, you can see between 300 to 800 people who live sleeping on cardboard boxes and don't have a home. Every person in this church has had enough preaching, I am positive, to make it to heaven. And if you are shedding tears as a sinner, those tears that you shed are an indication that you have a desire to be a Christian. And the good news is you can be one. There's the tears of the sinner, the tears of the saints. You know, sometimes a child of God sheds tears of joy. I'm thinking of an old saint of God who went to heaven about a year ago. Her name was Beulah Beecher. How many remember Beulah Beecher? Beulah Beecher was my Sunday school teacher when I was 16 years of age. And what a wonderful woman she was. I was on Facebook, quiet Randy, and I saw a post that said, please pray for Granny. She has just been admitted to the hospital at the Royal Oak Beaumont Hospital in Royal Oak, Michigan. She had been visiting one of her children, her son Gary, and who lives in our area. And so I got in the car and I drove over to the hospital and I walked in to the intensive care unit and I saw Sister Beulah Beecher all curled up in a ball on the bed. Now, that didn't happen when I was in the hospital. When I was in the hospital, I took up the bed, but she was just a little ball in the bed. And she looked at me kind of frightened. And I knew right away she didn't know who I was. And I said, do you know who I am? She said, no. I said, I'm Dan Plemmons, and you used to be my Sunday school teacher. She looked up at me and said, oh, Danny. I hate that. I mean, when you call me Danny, you know you've known me for a long time if you don't get clunked on the head. And a few days later, she went to heaven. You know, I thought of how many times I used to mow her lawn for $5 a week. Some of these kids growing up today wouldn't even pull out the lawnmower out of the garage for $5, let alone mow a big yard. $5 a week, I'd go mow her lawn, go knock on the door to get my $5, and she'd be crying. And I would say, Sister Beecher, are you okay? She said, oh, Danny, I've just been in the prayer closet. Sometimes a child of God sheds tears of joy. Sometimes they shed tears of burden. I have a brother who's in heaven tonight. He passed away at the age of 49 in 2009. But oh, the years that my parents aged because of my brother Don. I know I'm probably talking to people here tonight who have aged because of children. My brother Don was a wild child, if there ever was one. And he was just a rebel. If there was a rule, it had to be broken. There wasn't any such thing as obeying the rule. If there was a rule, he had to break it. He came here to Union Bible College, back was in the seminary, and went to God's Bible School, went just about all kinds of places, and just got in trouble everywhere he went. I remember he had gotten diabetes severely. He had lost a lot of weight. How many times his sugar range, his diabetes levels would go from the low 40s into the 30s, and within minutes could be up in 400 to 500. Just terrible numbers. He had divorced his wife of 26 years and could not live on his own, and he moved in with my parents, who at that time were pastoring in Lima, Ohio area. And it was very clear to all of us family that he wasn't going to live very long. And he was not ready to meet the Lord. We were out at the Don Nichols School one day, and Mom brought Don over to see us. And Mom came into the school, and she said, "Don, I'd like to talk to you outside." And I said, "Okay." I went out there, and I said, "How you doing, bro?" He said, "Fine." He said, "But Dan," he said, I wanted to talk to you. He said, "I've been doing some praying." He said, "You remember after you and Leah got married?" And he said, "We were on the phone, and I had to deal with car trouble." And he said, "We had words on the phone." He said, "You remember that, don't you?" And I said, "Yeah, I remember." I said, "Don, it was my fault." He said, "No, it wasn't. We about got in an argument, decided whose fault it was." He said, "I'm sorry." He said, he said, "I don't think I'm going to live very long." And he said, "I want to be ready." And I remember on that Sunday morning that the phone rang, and my sister Cheryl called me and said, "If you want to see Don while he's alive, you better get here." And I drove the 3 hours on that, I believe it was a Sunday morning. I drove the 3 hours to the Lima Memorial Hospital to see Don. Got into the waiting room, and my sister Cheryl Waters met me at the door of the waiting room and said, "I'll take you to see him." I didn't want to see him. I don't know if you're like me, but times like that, my stomach just gets tight in knots. And I didn't want to see what I knew I was getting ready to see. And I walked down the long hall with my sister Cheryl. And I walked into the room, and there he was lying down on the bed, and tubes coming out of his head because he'd had a stroke that pretty much took his life. And the next day, we were called back into the room as a family to say our goodbyes to my brother. And I'll never forget, Don was laying here, I was sitting right here, and my dad was standing right there. So Don's in the middle, I'm here, Dad's over there, and I'm looking right at my dad. Now, I don't know if there's any parents here tonight who have lost children, but that's just not how it's supposed to happen. I'll never forget looking into the face of my dad, who was getting ready to tell his boy goodbye for the last time. And I watched in 5 minutes as my dad aged probably 10 years. My brother Don, my dad had had one last talk with him. My dad had they had met at the house there, and Dad was saying, "Don, you're in such a bad physical condition. You need to do something about your soul." The next morning, Don came out of his room and said, "Dad, I want to talk to you." He said, "I want you to know that I did a lot of thinking and a lot of praying last night." And he said, "I want you to know that if I were to die right now, I'm completely ready to go to heaven. 3 days later, he did. And my brother is in heaven tonight because of a child of God, parents who shed tears of burden for their son. I give you that illustration not to tell you a story, but to tell you as children of God that if you are shedding tears of burden, do not stop, because their souls are hanging in the balance and they depend on your prayers. Sometimes they shed tears of loneliness, and I'm going to hurry here. I think of different times as I gaze out over my congregation of Dorcas Welch, who spent 30 years away from God, and she's alone now, and she's very lonely. I think of Sue Hartkoff, whose husband pastored the church that I pastor for 37 years, and he retired 15 years ago when I came to pastor the church, and he passed away, and she lives a lonely life. Esther Yeager, just many others that I could go into and name that live very lonely lives. Sometimes children of God shed tears of loneliness. The third set of tears that I would like to end with tonight, and that is the tears that are bottled up in a bottle. Revelation chapter 5, verse 8 says, "And when he had taken the book, the 4 beasts and 24 elders fell down before the Lamb, having every one of them harps and golden vials full of odors, which are the prayers of the saints." And I want to leave you with this thought, that, ladies and gentlemen, that every single prayer you pray, there's not one of them that's going to be discarded. It doesn't matter what that prayer is. Every single prayer that you have prayed, doesn't matter if you have prayed for a week, if you prayed for a month, if you've prayed for a year, or even 30 or 40 or 50 years, but you need to keep praying, because those prayers may not be answered to your specifications right now, but someday God's going to open up the bottle and he's going to pour the prayers out onto the altar. She was my cousin. Her name was Pat Holderfield, and she's now in heaven. Her mom was my aunt. Pat would come to church every time, and I don't know if this church has any shouters, but Pat was a shouter. I mean, she was a run the aisle kind of shouter. Every time she testified, it wasn't hardly possible for her to testify without shouting. I mean, run around the church 4 or 5 times. And as a little kid, I remember sitting on my feet so she didn't just run into me. And I remember one Wednesday night, she came to church and she testified and she got blessed. And she said, "I want this church to know something. God gave me a promise today that is going to save my mom." Now, that was my aunt, and I knew my aunt. And I laughed. And I thought, there's no way the Lord's going to save Dallas. I mean, this woman, I don't even know how many times she's been married. I mean, she's just love him and leave him. She's been married more than Elizabeth Taylor. I mean, she's a wild lady. I mean, no, it's not going to happen. I was probably 9 or 10 years of age at that point, and I grew up and out in every other which way. And I remember going off to God's Bible College and got in the choir in one of the quartets. And we were out in Knoxville, Tennessee, singing on choir tour at Howard Russell's church, who is the head of the Christian Healthcare Ministries now. But we were at his church singing that night, and 2 ladies started staring at me. I thought, what is their trouble? I mean, is my head screwed on backwards? Why are they looking at me? I mean, every time I would look this way and turn and go, they would look at me. And I'm thinking, what is your deal? Well, back in those days, the choir members, we used to, on the risers, we used to have to introduce ourselves. My name is Dan Plemmons. I'm from Decatur, Illinois, and I'm a junior in whatever. I was actually in high school in the college choir, but I'm whatever I was at that point. And I was on the riser crew. After service, it was our job to pick up the risers and carry them to the bus. And while we were doing that, the older lady came up to me with the younger lady, And she said, "Did you say your name was Dan Plemmons?" I said, "Yes, ma'am, I did." She said, "Do you know me?" I said, "I haven't seen you in my life." I said, "But you know the funny thing is," I said, "you've looked at me throughout the entire service. But I said, the funny thing is you look like my mother." She said, "I ought to. I'm your mother's oldest sister." I said, "You're kidding." She said, she said, "I spent all those years, 50 some years away from the Lord." And she said, "God has saved me." And I thought of Pat Overfield that ran around the church and said, "God gave me a promise. He's going to save my mom." Well, I need to just close. Promises, promises, and all of them are true. He has done exactly what he said he would do. He didn't tell me my heart would not be broken, but he did say he would mend it again. He didn't promise that my cross would not get heavy, but he did say my load he would share. He didn't tell me he'd grant my hopes and wishes, but he did say he'd hear my earnest prayer. And I've just come here to tell you tonight, if you've got a heart that is broken, if you've been shedding tears, I want you to know that tears are a language that God understands.